The snow fell in thick curtains across the Ardennes forest that December morning in 1944 through the White Veil. American infantrymen could hear them before they could see them, the grinding, metallic scream of tracked vehicles pushing through frozen mud. Then the trees parted, and there they were, 7 Panzer IV tanks. Their long 75mm guns sweeping the tree line, hunting for targets. Inside a hastily dug position, barely 30 yards from the forest road, a 3-man bazooka team waited. They had 9 rockets total, 9 rockets for 7 tanks. The mathematics were brutal, and everyone knew it. What happened in the next 9 minutes would become one of those moments that changes how armies think about infantry anti-tank warfare. But the story doesn't start there. It starts weeks earlier with a tactical doctrine that nearly got laughed out of the training ground. The American bazooka officially designated the M1A1 rocket launcher was never supposed to be a tank killer. Not really. When ordnance officers first fielded it in 1942, they designed it as a bunker buster, a portable artillery piece that could take out fortified positions without calling in heavy support. The shape-charred warhead could penetrate about 4 inches of armor under ideal conditions. Against the thin-skinned Panzer IIs and early Panzer IVs of North Africa, that was adequate. Against the up-armored monsters rolling off German production lines by late 1944. It was a prayer wrapped in explosives. Standard doctrine called for bazooka teams to engage tanks from the flank or rear where armor was thinner. You positioned yourself in defilade, waited for the enemy column to pass. Then took your shot at the engine compartment or the vulnerable spots behind the turret ring. It was textbook, it was safe, it made perfect sense. And one American officer thought it was completely wrong. The tactical debates that raged through infantry training centers in late 1943 rarely make it into history books. They should. While strategists argued about broad campaigns and generals moved divisions across maps, junior officers were trying to solve a desperate problem. How do you stop a tank when you're outgunned, out-armored, and probably about to die? The orthodox approach emphasized survival. Keep your distance. Uzi terrain. Wait for the perfect shot. The unorthodox approach, the one that got officers written up for wasting ammunition during training exercises, said something different. Get close, get deadly, get it done before they know you're there. Close meant close. Not 50 yards, not 30 yards. Close enough to smell the diesel exhaust. Close enough to hear the crew talking inside. Close enough that if you missed, you wouldn't get a second chance. The theory went like this. German tank commanders had a blind spot. The closer you got to a Panzer, the harder it became for the crew to acquire you as a target. The main gun couldn't depress low enough. The whole machine gun had limited traverse. The commander's cupola had visibility arcs, but in combo with infantry support moving around the tank. With smoke and noise and confusion, those arcs became gambling odds. If you could get within 25 yards, that golden distance, where you were too close for the main gun and too unpredictable for the machine guns. You could take a frontal shot at the glacis plate, the lower hull, or the driver's viewport. The bazooka-shaped charge wouldn't always penetrate the thickest armor, but it didn't have to. The concussive force against the hull could injure the crew, damage optics, or disable track assemblies, and fear was a weapon too. A tank that thinks it's being hunted from knife fighting range is a tank that makes mistakes. German tankers called this tactic. American infantrymen had a simpler term, the close quarters doctrine, and in the winter of 1944, somewhere in the frozen forests of Belgium, it was about to be tested in the most unforgiving classroom imaginable. If you have your own story about infantry and tank tactics, or if your family has connections to this history, share it in the comments below. These personal accounts keep history alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into untold chapters of history. The Ardennes offensive caught the Allied command structure by surprise, but it didn't catch the infantrymen in the line by surprise. They'd been hearing it for days, the distant rumble of armor concentrating behind German lines. The unusual radio silence, the probing attacks that felt different from the usual defensive operations. Something was building. The men in the foxholes knew it. The men at headquarters believed in intelligence reports that said the German army was finished, incapable of mounting a major offensive. The men in the foxholes were right. When the attack came on December 16th, it came with a violence that erased unit boundaries and turned forest roads into kill. Entire companies found themselves cut off, surrounded by armor they couldn't stop and infantry they couldn't see. The Panzer spearheads pushed deep into American positions, exploiting gaps. bypassing strongpoints, racing for the bridges over the Meuse River. In that chaos, the rigid doctrines meant for set-piece battles became suggestions at best. Officers made decisions based on what was in front of them, not what was in the manual. And in one unnamed Belgian forest, a lieutenant made a decision that would either save his men or kill them all. The Bazooka team consisted of 3 men, a gunner, a loader, and an ammunition bearer. Standard practice put them in a support role behind the rifle line, ready to move forward when armor appeared. The close quarters doctrine changed everything. It made them scouts, stalkers, ambush, predators. They had to think like tankers to kill tankers. The team dug in 20 yards off a forest trail that intelligence suggested might become a German route of advance. Intelligence was right. As dawn broke on the second day of the offensive, the sound of tracks on frozen ground announced the approach of a German armored column. 7 tanks, Panzer IVs, the workhorses of the Panzer divisions. Each one mounted a 75mm KWK-40 gun capable of destroying any American tank at standard combat ranges. Each one carried a crew of 5, protected by up to 80mm of frontal armor. Each one represented mobile firepower that could shatter an infantry company if left unchecked. The standard response would have been to call in artillery to radio for tank destroyer support to let the armor handle the armor, but there was no radio contact. Artillery was prioritized for defensive fires around critical positions. The tank destroyers were scattered across 20 miles of front, trying to plug gaps that kept appearing like wounds in flesh. It was just the Bazooka team, 9 rockets, and a doctrine that most of the army thought was insane. The lead Panzer rounded the bend in the trail, moving slowly, cautiously. The commander stood in the cupola, scanning the trees. Behind it, the other 6 tanks followed at intervals, maintaining spacing to avoid presenting a clustered target. They were doing everything right. Textbook German armor tactics, refined through years of combat on the Eastern Front. The Bazooka gunner let the lead tank pass. This was the hardest part, the discipline to wait, to let thousands of pounds of death mesh and roll within spitting distance, to trust that the concealment would hold. The second tank approached. Still, they waited. The 3rd Panzer stopped. The commander was looking at something in the trees, maybe a shadow, maybe nothing. The column halted. This was the moment the formation was static. The crews were focused on their sectors, and the Bazooka team was inside the kill zone they'd calculated. 22 yards from the closest tank. Close enough. The first rocket caught the stopped Panzer on the lower glacis plate, right where the frontal armor met the hull bottom. The shaped charge punched through, and the tank shuddered. No explosion, no Hollywood fireball, just a shudder, and then smoke began pouring from the driver's hatch. The crew bailed out immediately, stumbling into the snow, one man's uniform already burning. If you're interested in the technical evolution of anti-tank weapons, or if you have family stories about close quarters combat, share them in the comments below. These personal accounts keep history alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into untold chapters of history. The German column reacted exactly as predicted and exactly wrong. The rear tanks began backing up, trying to create distance from the ambush. The forward tanks tried to acquire targets, turrets traversing wildly, machine guns firing blindly into the tree line. But they were looking too far out. The Bazooka team was inside their decision loop, inside their targeting solutions, inside their understanding of how infantry should behave. The second shot hit the lead Panzer in the track assembly. The M1A1 Bazooka shaped charge wasn't designed primarily as a track buster, but at 22 yards, the blast effect was devastating. The track separated from the drive sprocket, and the Panzer lurched to a halt, blocking the trail. Now the column couldn't advance or retreat without maneuvering around disabled vehicles. The mathematics of the ambush were working. The loader was already slamming another rocket into the tube. The ammunition bearer was counting 7 rockets left, 5 tanks still mobile. The gunner was selecting the next target based on threat and opportunity. This wasn't panic firing. This was execution. Tank number 4 tried to reverse around the disabled lead vehicle. Its commander made the mistake of focusing on the maneuver instead of the threat. The 3rd rocket hit the turret ring from an oblique angle as the tank pivoted. The explosion didn't penetrate the main armor, but the concussive force against the turret mechanism jammed the traverse. The main gun froze in place, pointing uselessly at empty forest. Another Panzer effectively out of the fight. This is where training separated survival from theory. The Bazooka team had practiced reloading drills until muscle memory replaced conscious thought. Under fire, with machine gun bullets chewing bark off the trees above them, with the sound of 75mm rounds detonating somewhere behind them, they worked the problem. Load, aim, fire, move. The doctrine demanded constant position changes. Shoot twice from one spot and you were dead. They shifted 15 feet to their left flank, using the smoke from the burning Panzer as concealment. The German infantry support, which had been moving alongside the tanks, was now pinned down by their own armor's wild, suppressive fire. Nobody knew where the Bazooka team was. That was the point. The fourth rocket missed. It happens. Combat isn't a shooting range. The projectile sailed over the intended target and detonated against a tree. 5 rockets left. 4 mobile tanks. The 5th rocket didn't miss. It caught a Panzer IV that was trying to flank around the stopped column, moving through the trees off the main trail. The gunner led the target perfectly, and the shaped charge hit the thinner side armor just behind the driver's compartment. This time there was secondary detonation of munition or fuel. Impossible to tell. The Panzer stopped moving. Crew members emerged from the hatches, and they were running, not fighting. 6 minutes had elapsed since the first shot. The German column was disintegrating. The remaining 3 tanks were still dangerous, still deadly, but their cohesion was gone. One commander made the decision to push forward, trying to break through the ambush by driving over the disabled lead vehicle. It was a command decision born of desperation, and it created an opportunity. When a tank climbs over an obstacle, it exposes its belly armor, the thinnest armor on any tracked vehicle. For perhaps 3 seconds, the Panzer IV's whole bottom was visible, angled up toward the Bazooka position. The 6th rocket was already in flight before the conscious mind could calculate the shot. It struck the exposed belly plate, and this time the kill was instantaneous. The tank rolled forward another few feet and stopped, dead in the trail. If you have technical knowledge about armored warfare, or if your family has connections to the Ardennes campaign, share it in the comments below. These personal accounts keep history alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into untold chapters of history. 3 rockets remaining. 2 tanks still operational, but the remaining German Almar had had enough. The doctrine of aggressive forward momentum, drilled into every Panzer commander from training onward, met the reality of an enemy that refused to behave according to established patterns. The 2 surviving tanks retreated, backing down the trail, firing suppressive rounds but not pressing the attack. The Bazooka team didn't pursue. That wasn't the mission. The mission was denial of terrain, and that mission was accomplished. 7 Panzers had entered that forest trail, 2 left under their own power. 5 remained burning or disabled, blocking the route for any follow-on forces. 9 minutes, 7 tanks, 9 rockets with 3 The after-action analysis came later, written by officers who hadn't been there but needed to understand what had happened. The official reports focused on tactical positioning, fields of fire crew discipline under stress. What they struggled to capture was the psychological component, the way that doctrine becomes instinct under fire. The way that trained reactions override fear, the way the 3 men with a weapon everyone said couldn't kill tanks proceeded to kill tanks. German combat reports from that sector noted heavy anti-tank gun presence in the forest. They assumed the ambush had been executed by a towed anti-tank gun, probably a 57mm. The idea that a 3-man Bazooka team had destroyed an armored column at point-blank range didn't fit their tactical framework. It sounded like propaganda, like the kind of thing you tell infantry to make them feel better about facing armor. But it had happened, and it kept happening. The close quarters doctrine spread through infantry units in the Ardennes, not through official channels, but through the oldest military communication network. Soldiers talking to soldiers. Bazooka teams began training in the spaces between combat operations, practicing the aggressive positioning, the rapid reloading, the constant movement that kept them alive inside the killing radius of tank weapons. The doctrine wasn't perfect. Casualty rates for anti-tank teams remained high throughout the campaign. For every successful ambush, there were teams that got spotted too early, that took machine gun fire before they could engage, that fired and missed and didn't get another chance. The tactic worked, but it demanded perfection under the worst possible conditions. What made it viable wasn't just courage alone, kill soldiers. What made it viable was the intersection of weapon capability, tactical understanding, and crew training. The M1A1 Bazooka had the penetration to threaten German armor if you could get the geometry right. The close quarters approach gave you that geometry, and the crew training, drilled over hundreds of repetitions until it became reflex, gave you the execution speed to survive the encounter. The mathematical reality was brutal. A Panzer IV could kill you from 2,000 yards. You could kill it from 25 yards. That asymmetry defined everything. You had to close the distance without being spotted, acquire your target without exposing your position, and execute your attack before the tank crew could react. Each step was a point of failure. Each failure was lethal. Yet the doctrine worked often enough that by January 1945, training manuals were being... The official guidance still emphasized flank shots and standoff range, but a new section appeared covering close-range engagement techniques for emergency situations. That was military bureaucracy's way of admitting that sometimes the crazy tactic that shouldn't work is the only tactic that does. If you're interested in how tactical doctrines evolve under combat pressure, or if you have family stories about the Ardennes, share them in the comments below. These personal accounts keep history alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into untold chapters of history. The human element in these stories matters more than the technical specifications, though both are inseparable. The men who executed these ambushes weren't superhuman. They were draftees and volunteers, farmers and factory workers, most of them barely out of their teens. What made them effective wasn't physical superiority or a tactical genius, it was repetition, discipline, and the kind of trust that only forms when your life depends on the two men next to you doing their jobs perfectly. The gunner's role required steady hands and the ability to lead moving targets while under fire. The loader's role required speed and reliability every second spent fumbling a rocket into the... 2 was a second the enemy had to spot your position. The ammunition bearer had to track rounds expended, calculate remaining capability, and be ready to take over either role if someone went down. That three-man team in the Ardennes Forest executed 9 Action 7 shots fired to position Chenzi in 9 minutes, while German army tried to kill them. The physical actions were trainable. The mental composure under those conditions was something else entirely. German tankers had their own perspective on these encounters, and those perspectives survived in after-action reports and post-war interviews. They described the psychological impact of infantry weapons that could threaten them at ranges where the infantry should have been helpless. The Eastern Front had taught them to fear Soviet anti-tank rifles and satchel charges. The Western Front taught them to fear American bazooka teams that hunted like wolves, getting inside the tank's defensive perimeter and striking before the crew could react. One German tank commander described the experience as fighting ghosts. You couldn't see them until they fired. Once they fired, they moved. If you suppressed their position, they were already somewhere else. If you tried to back away, you exposed your thinner rear armor. If you advanced, you drove deeper into their engagement zone. The tactical options narrowed until there were no good choices, only degrees of bad. This was the psychological warfare embedded in the close quarters doctrine. It forced tank commanders into reactive thinking, taking away the initiative that made armor so effective. A panzer column advancing into empty terrain could control the pace of battle. A panzer column in a forest, with bazooka teams inside 30 yards, was already behind in the decision cycle, already fighting someone else's battle plan. The weapons technology mattered, but it was just one component. The M1A1 bazooka weighed 13 pounds empty at a rocket, and you were carrying 15 pounds of launcher and ammunition. That's manageable for infantry who need to move fast and stay concealed. Compare that to a towed anti-tank gun at 2,500 pounds, requiring a vehicle to move and a crew to serve it. The bazooka gave infantry the ability to be everywhere, to appear from nowhere, to threaten armor without the logistical footprint that traditional anti-tank weapons demanded. The shape-charge warhead worked through a principle that sounds like science fiction but is pure physics. A conical metal liner backed by high explosive. When the explosive it collapses the liner into a hypervelocity jet of molten metal that penetrates armor through sheer force. Against homogeneous steel armor, a properly designed shape charge can punch through armor several times thicker than the warhead diameter. The M1A1's warhead could theoretically penetrate 5 inches of armor at optimal angles, but theory and combat reality don't always align. Angle of impact mattered. Distance mattered too close, and the warhead didn't have space to form the jet properly. Too far and accuracy degraded. Surface conditions mattered a Panzer. With spare track links bolted to the glacis could defeat a shape charge through spaced armor effects. That's why the 90-minute engagement in the Ardennes Forest required 7 rockets to stop 7 tanks. Not every hit was a kill. some damaged tracks, some stunned crews, some forced commander decisions to abandon vehicles that might have been recoverable. The combination of mechanical damage and psychological impact created tactical kill stanks that withdrew from the fight, even if they could technically still operate. If you're fascinated by the engineering behind World War II weapon systems, or if you have family connections to armored warfare, share your stories in the comments below. These personal accounts keep history alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into untold chapters of history. The tactical evolution didn't stop with the Ardennes. By early 1945, both American and British forces were refining close-quarters anti-tank techniques based on combat experience. Training centers incorporated realistic ambush scenarios. Infantry schools taught stalking techniques borrowed from scouting doctrine. Supply systems prioritized ammunition allocation for bazooka teams, recognizing that 9 rockets might not be enough if you encountered a full company of armor. The Germans, for their part, adapted their own tactics. Tank commanders became more cautious about forest approaches. Infantry support stayed closer to the armor. Pre-attack reconnaissance became more thorough, but adaptation takes time, and in late 1944, the Panzers were being committed to offensive operations that demanded speed and aggression. Caution was a luxury the German offensive couldn't afford. This created a window, a period of weeks, where American infantry had refined a tactic faster than German armor could develop. In warfare, these windows are rare and decisive. They don't last. Eventually, the enemy learns. Eventually, your advantage becomes common knowledge, and common knowledge becomes expected, and expected becomes countered. But during that window, bazooka teams accomplished something remarkable. They gave infantry a fighting chance against armor in terrain where armor should have been invincible. The forest ambush became a viable tactical option instead of a desperation play. The long-term impact reshaped infantry doctrine across multiple armies. Post-war analysis recognized that the combination of portable anti-tank weapons and trained infantry could contest terrain that previously required heavy weapons or air support. The concept influenced everything from the development of modern rocket-propelled grenades to the tactical employment of mechanized infantry in combat arms operations. The specific engagement 3 men, 7 tanks, 9 minutes became a case study in military training programs. Not because it was typical, but because it demonstrated what was possible when doctrine, training, and equipment aligned with battlefield reality. Most bazooka teams didn't destroy 7 tanks. Most engagements didn't unfold with such decisive results, but the fact that it could happen, that it did happen, changed how armies thought about infantry capability. The men who executed that ambush, assuming they survived the war, probably didn't talk much about it afterward. That's often how it goes. The moment that changes military history is just another day survived for the people who lived it. The fear, the adrenaline, the absolute certainty that the next second might be your last, those memories don't translate well to peacetime conversations. What translates is the legacy. Infantry could fight armor, not by running away, not by waiting for help, but by embracing tactics that required getting closer to danger than any sane person would volunteer for. The close quarters doctrine asked soldiers to do something that contradicted every survival instinct. Instead of fleeing from the tank, more V toward it. That psychological inversion, turning prey into predator, was as important as the technical capability of the weapon. It changed how infantrymen thought about themselves. You weren't helpless against armor. You were dangerous. If you had the training, the weapon, and the nerve, you could kill the tank before it killed you. The doctrine spread beyond the Ardennes, beyond the European theater, beyond World War II. Every modern infantry anti-tank team owes something to those early experiments in close quarters engagement. The specific weapons have evolved. The M1A1 bazooka gave way to the M20 Super Bazooka, then 2 guided missiles, then 2 sophisticated fire and forget systems. But the fundamental principle remains: properly trained infantry with the right weapons can threaten armored vehicles, even when outgunned and outweighed. If you're interested in how modern military tactics evolved from World War II innovations, or if you have family stories about infantry combat, share them in the comments below. These personal accounts keep history alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into untold chapters of history. The Wind that Av 1944 saw countless acts of courage and desperation across the Ardennes forest. Some became famous, commemorated in memorials and history books. Others remained anonymous, known only to the men who lived them and the unit records that documented them with bureaucratic precision. The 7-tank ambush falls somewhere in between documented enough to verify it happened, anonymous enough that the specific names and unit designations remain obscured by classified records and incomplete after-action reports. What we know for certain: it happened. 3 men with 9 rockets stopped 7 Panzers in 9 minutes using a tactic that military doctrine said shouldn't work. What we can infer: similar engagements happened across multiple sectors, executed by different teams who never knew about each other, all discovering through trial and error that the close quarters doctrine gave them a chance. The cost was never trivial. For every successful bazooka ambush, there were teams that died trying. The tactic required perfection, and perfection under fire is a standard that humans can only approximate. You had to get close enough to threaten the tank without getting close enough to be killed by it. That margin was sometimes measured in feet. A few steps too far, and the tank's machine guns found you. A few steps too timid and your rocket couldn't penetrate the armor. The crews who survived learned to read terrain like tankers, to think about approach angles and dead ground and fields of fire. They learned to listen for the differences between track types, to identify vehicle models by engine sound, to estimate speed and distance without instruments. These were skills you couldn't teach in a classroom. They came from experience, and experience came from surviving encounters that killed most of the people who tried them. The psychological burden on these teams was immense. You volunteered to carry a weapon that made you a priority target for every enemy soldier who saw you. Tank commanders knew that bazooka teams were the primary threat to their vehicles. If they spotted you, every weapon on that tank oriented toward your position. You weren't just fighting the tank. You were fighting the infantry support, the supporting armor, the artillery that got called in once your position was reported. Survival meant perfection in execution and a degree of luck that no amount of training could guarantee. Some men executed perfect ambushes and died when a random artillery shell landed in their position. Others made mistakes that should have been fatal and survived because the tank commander looked the wrong direction at the critical moment. In war, skill increases your odds, but it never eliminates the role of chance. The post-war period saw attempts to quantify the effectiveness of close-quarters anti-tank tactics. Military researchers wanted numbers: percentage of kills per rocket fired, average engagement range, survival rates for bazooka teams using different doctrines. The data was messy. Not all units reported with the same level of detail. Not all successful engagements got documented. Not all documented engagements could be verified through enemy records. What emerged from the analysis was a rough pattern. Close quarters tactics increased the kill probability per rocket from about 15% to nearly 40%. But they also increased casualty rates for the bazooka teams by roughly the same proportion. You traded safety for effectiveness. That calculation changes based on the tactical situation. If you need to stop that tank column and you need to do it now, 40% kill probability looks good. If you're trying to survive until the war ends, those odds look terrifying. The German perspective on these tactics shows up in training documents and tactical assessments from late 1944 and early 1945. They recognized the threat. They issued guidance on counter-tactics, maintain infantry screens close to armor, use suppressive fire liberally when entering likely ambush terrain, avoid predictable routes through forests and villages. Some units implemented these countermeasures effectively. Others, pressed by operational demands and stretched thin across collapsing defensive lines, couldn't afford the caution. If you're fascinated by the tactical evolution of warfare, or if you have family connections to the armored battles of 1940-45, share your stories in the comments below. These personal accounts keep history alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into untold chapters of history. The technological arms race that defined World War II armor combat created a constant cycle of innovation and counter-innovation. Thicker armor led to more powerful guns. More powerful guns led to heavier tanks. Heavier tanks led to portable anti-tank weapons. Portable anti-tank weapons led to tactics that could exploit their capabilities. Each step in the cycle represented thousands of hours of engineering work, millions in manufacturing investment, and ultimately lives won or lost based on which side adapted faster. The M1A1 bazooka represented American industrial philosophy applied to warfare. Produce a weapon that was good enough, manufacturable in quantity, and simple enough that a drafted civilian could learn to use it in weeks. It wasn't the most sophisticated anti-tank weapon of the war. The German Panzerschreck was more powerful. The British PAAT had some advantages in low-light conditions, but the bazooka worked. It was reliable, and most importantly, America could produce them by the tens of thousands. By late 1944, American industry had delivered over 460,000 bazookas to the military. That scale of production meant that even small infantry units could have dedicated anti-tank capability. Compare that to German production of the Panzers, roughly 290,000 over the entire war, supporting an army that was being bled white on two fronts. Numbers mattered. Having enough bazookas meant that losses in combat didn't create gaps in capability. The shape charge technology behind the bazooka traced its lineage to research done in the 1930s by American physicist Charles Edward Munro. He discovered that explosives shaped in specific configurations could focus their blast effect, penetrating materials that would resist conventional explosives. The military applications took years to develop, but by 1942, the concepts had been refined into a man-portable weapon system. The physics are elegant in their violence. The hollow charge collapses inward under detonation pressure, forming a hypersonic jet of plasma and molten metal that reaches velocities over 25,000 feet per second. At those velocities, armor doesn't stop, the jet flows around it. The penetration isn't mechanical in the traditional sense. It's hydrodynamic, treating solid steel like a fluid under extreme pressure, but shaped charges have limitations. Standoff distance matters too close, and the jet doesn't form properly. Angle of impact matters. Oblique hits disperse the jet's energy. Reactive armor and spaced armor can disrupt the jet before it reaches the main armor. By 1944, German tank designers were starting to incorporate these countermeasures, adding shurs and side skirts and applique armor to their vehicles. The tactical response was to get closer, to aim for specific vulnerable points, to turn the engagement into a point-blank duel where precision mattered more than raw penetration capability. This was the evolution that led to the close-quarters doctrine, not as a planned tactical innovation, but as an emergent solution to an engineering problem. The men who executed these tactics mostly didn't understand the physics. They needed to know where to aim, how close to get, and how to survive the encounter. The engineering details were relevant to the people designing the weapons and the officers writing the doctrine. The infantrymen needed simpler knowledge. This weapon can kill that tank if you do these specific things. Training programs evolved to match the doctrine. Early in the war, bazooka training focused on marksmanship and mechanical operation. By 1944, training included stalking techniques, camouflage discipline team coordination drills, and stress inoculation exercises designed to prepare soldiers for the psychological reality of engaging armor at close range. The stress inoculation part was critical. You can't simulate the terror of a panzer bearing down on your position, but you can create training scenarios that approximate the stress response. Live fire exercises with friendly tanks playing the role of enemy armor. Scenarios where instructors create noise, confusion, and time pressure. Drills repeated until the physical actions become automatic, freeing the conscious mind to handle the decision-making that can't be automated. If you're interested in military training evolution, or if you have family stories about preparing for combat, share them in the comments below. These personal accounts keep history alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into untold chapters of history. The winter conditions in the Ardennes added another layer of complexity to close quarters into tank warfare. Snow provided visual camouflage, but also created tracks that could betray your position. Frozen ground meant you couldn't dig proper fighting positions, relying instead on natural defilade and hastily cleared firing lanes. Cold-affected weapon reliability. The M1A1's electrical firing system could fail in extreme temperatures, requiring backup percussion primers. The human body struggles in cold. Fingers lose dexterity. Reaction time slows. The weight of winter clothing restricts movement. All of this mattered when you needed to execute precise actions under time pressure while someone was actively trying to kill you. The successful teams adapted will trigger finger gloves that balanced warmth with tactile feedback, layered clothing systems that allowed quick movement, pre-positioned ammunition to avoid fumbling with frozen fingers. German tankers faced their own cold weather challenges. Engine starts became uncertain. Hydraulic systems for turret traverse slowed or failed. Vision blocks frosted over. In some ways, the cold equalized the technological imbalance between armor and infantry. A panzer that couldn't reliably start its engine was no more effective than an immobile pillbox. And immobile targets are what bazooka teams trained to kill. The Ardennes offensive coincided with what became known as the coldest European winter in decades. Temperatures dropped below 0 Fahrenheit, snow accumulated in drifts that made cross-country movement nearly impossible. Supply lines, already strained by the rapid German advance and the surprise nature of the offensive, struggled to deliver not just ammunition and fuel, but the basic necessities of winter survival. In that environment, tactical doctrine had to adapt to physical reality. The close quarters ambush tactic worked partly because both sides were constrained by terrain and weather. Tanks stuck to roads and trails because the snow was too deep for cross-country movement. That created predictable routes. Predictable routes created ambush opportunities. Ambush opportunities gave infantry the chance to execute tactics that required precise positioning. The 7-tank engagement happened because the German armor was road-bound. If those Panzers had been able to maneuver freely across open ground, deploying into combat formation with mutual support, the outcome would have been different. The forests channelized them. The snow confined them. The terrain that should have favored the defender instead created kill zones that favored whoever controlled the close approaches. This intersection of terrain, whether technology and tactical doctrine, is where battles get won or lost. Grand strategy matters, operational planning matters, but at the point of contact, where individual soldiers make split-second decisions with incomplete information, the outcome depends on who has adapted better to the specific conditions of that moment, that place, that fight. The American military's strength during World War II wasn't technological superiority. German tanks were generally better. German infantry weapons were often more sophisticated. The American strength was adaptive capacity, the ability to identify problems, develop solutions, distribute those solutions across the force, and implement them before the tactical situation changed again. The close quarters bazooka doctrine exemplifies that adaptive capacity. It emerged from field testing, not laboratory development. It spread through informal channels, not official directives. It got refined through combat experience, not theoretical analysis. By the time it appeared in training manuals, it had already been proven in dozens of small unit actions across the Ardennes front. That's how effective military doctrine often develops from the bottom up. Tested in combat, adopted because it works, formalized only after it's already common practice. The alternative approach, top-down doctrine, imposed by headquarters staff who haven't seen the specific tactical problem, tends to produce doctrine that looks good on paper but fails in contact with reality. If you're atento novamente zero continuer in how military tactics evolve in real combat conditions, or if you have family stories about adaptation under fire, share them in the comments below. These personal accounts keep history alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into untold chapters of history. The aftermath of successful bazooka ambushes created its own set of tactical problems. 7 disabled Panzers blocking a forest trail represented immediate tactical success, but they also created logistical questions. Do you stay in position and defend the kill? Do you withdraw before enemy reinforcements arrive? Do you try to destroy the disabled vehicles completely to deny recovery operations? Standard doctrine suggested withdrawal. You'd accomplish the mission denied, the enemy use of that route. Staying invited to counterattack by enemy infantry who would be highly motivated to clear the ambush site and recover their armor. But withdrawal meant abandoning observation of a critical avenue of approach. It meant losing intelligence about enemy intentions and follow-on forces. The 3-man bazooka team that stopped 7 Panzers made the decision to withdraw after the engagement. They displaced to a secondary position with observation capability but outside the immediate counterattack zone. Over the next hours, they watched German recovery crews arrive, assess the damaged vehicles, and begin the slow process of determining what could be saved and what had to be abandoned. Tank recovery in combat conditions was a specialized nightmare. A disabled Panzer weighed 25 tons. Moving it required heavy recovery vehicles, which themselves were vulnerable to ambush. The process took hours, required clear access routes, and exposed the recovery team to artillery and air attack. In the fluid conditions of the Ardennes offensive, with Allied forces still reacting to the German breakthrough, recovery operations became a calculated risk. Of the 7 Panzers stopped in that engagement, German records suggest 3 were eventually recovered and returned to service, 2 were stripped for parts, 2 were abandoned as total losses. That recovery rate, truthfully 40%, was typical for armored units operating in contested terrain. The bazooka ambush hadn't just destroyed tanks. It had forced the German armored column to allocate resources and time to recovery operations, slowing the offensive momentum. This is the hidden cost of successful anti-tank operations that casualty reports don't capture. Every disabled vehicle creates a logistical drag. Every crew that bails out represents personnel who are no longer combat effective, at least temporarily. Every armor column that approaches ambush terrain cautiously is a column that moves slower, advances less far, accomplishes less of its operational objective. The German offensive in the Ardennes was fundamentally a race against time and logistics. The plan required reaching objectives before American reinforcements could arrive, before supply lines stretched beyond sustainability, before weather improved enough for Allied air power to dominate the battlefield. Every delay mattered. Every tactical setback accumulated into operational failure. Individual bazooka ambushes didn't stop the German offensive, but they contributed to the accumulation of delays, casualties, and resource expenditure that eventually exhausted the attack. This is often how warfare actually works, not through decisive single battles, but through the grinding accumulation of tactical defeats that erode operational capability until the offensive culminates and collapses. By late December 1944, the German spearheads had advanced as far as they would reach. American reinforcements arrived. The weather cleared enough for air support to become decisive. Supply problems that German planners had hoped to solve by capturing American fuel dumps instead became insurmountable. The offensive that was supposed to split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace instead consumed the last mobile reserves of the German army. The close-quarters anti-tank tactics developed during the Ardennes campaign continued to evolve through the final months of the war. As Allied forces pushed into Germany itself, bazooka teams found themselves fighting in urban terrain where the close-quarters doctrine translated even more effectively. City streets channelized armor the same way forest trails did. Buildings provided concealment and firing positions. The engagement ranges that made bazookas effective became the norm rather than the exception. If you're fascinated by urban warfare tactics, or if you have family connections to the final campaigns in Europe, share your stories in the comments below. These personal accounts keep history alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into untold chapters of history. Urban anti-tank warfare introduced new challenges and opportunities. A bazooka team positioned on an upper floor could fire down onto the thinner top armor of tanks. The vertical angle of attack that was impossible in forest fighting became standard in cities, but urban environments also concentrated defending forces. Every building could hide infantry. Every rubble pile could conceal a firing position. The tank's vulnerability increased, but so did the danger to the anti-tank team. German defenders adapted their tactics to the urban environment. They positioned armor in hold-down positions behind rubble barriers, exposing only the turret and main gun. They used buildings as mobile cover, advancing from one protected position to another. They concentrated their remaining armor in counterattack forces rather than spreading it along defensive lines. Betting that rapid response could eliminate penetrations before they could be exploited, these adaptations created a chess game of position and timing. American infantry with bazookas had to identify where the armor was concentrated, where the likely counterattack routes existed, and how to position themselves to interdict those routes without being caught in the inevitable supporting artillery fire. The tactical problem became three-dimensional, not just where on the map, but which floor of which building, with what fields of fire and what escape routes. The M1A1 bazooka showed its limitations in urban fighting. The backblast from firing in enclosed spaces was dangerous to the crew and revealed their position immediately. Teams had to fire from positions with rear clearance windows, doorways, Breachwalzen, then immediately displaced before return fire arrived. The reload time between shots, which was manageable in forest ambushes with concealment, became critical in urban environments where everyone could see the smoke and dust from your firing position. Some teams improvised solutions.